Welcome to Dark Deeds and Conspiracy, the podcast where we delve into chilling true crime stories and mysterious conspiracies that have left us questioning everything. Thank you for joining us today as we explore another dark chapter in history.
All right, let's get right into it. Dyatlov Pass. Chilling, right?
Yeah.
Just the name itself, it's one of those stories, it just sticks with you. Because it's this clash, right? You've got a group of experienced hikers, like seasoned adventurers, and they head out into these really remote Ural mountains back in 1959. And then something goes terribly wrong. And it's not like a simple misstep or like getting caught in a blizzard,
Yeah.
These guys knew what they were doing. So the question is, what happened?
Yeah, and that's exactly what keeps people coming back to this case, even after all this time. The circumstances of their deaths. Totally bizarre. We're not just talking about a hiking accident here. This is a puzzle with, missing pieces, Things that just don't add up.
Exactly. I mean, initially it was a group of 10, mostly students, some grads, from this place called the Ural Polytechnical Institute, led by a guy named Igor Dyatlov. Their goal was pretty ambitious, Mount Notorten. It was a Category 3 hike, the hardest level back then, meaning you had to know what you were doing. One guy, Yuri Yudin, actually had to turn back early, got sick. Ironically, he's the only one who survived. And later on, his insights into the group, like their personalities and the whole context of that time, it adds this extra layer of intrigue.
Oh, absolutely. Yudin turning back. It's tragic for him, obviously, but it gives us this unique before and after view. He knew these people, their skills, how prepared they were, the whole vibe of the trip at the start. That's invaluable.
And then there's the discovery of the rest of the group. Oh, man, this is where it gets really creepy. So they don't return when they're supposed to, right? Search party goes out, and they find their tent abandoned, February 26th. Imagine this. Tent's half collapsed, covered in snow. But get this, it's cut open from the inside. And leading away from the tent, footprints in the snow. Some are just sock prints, some barefoot. What's the first thing that jumps out at you there?
That detail about the tent, it screams emergency, right? They didn't just pack up and leave. They bolted. Something spooked them, something bad. And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What on earth were they running from? They left essential stuff behind, warm clothes, everything you'd need to survive in that freezing wasteland. Whatever it was more terrifying than the cold itself.
Oh, it gets way weirder, way weirder. The bodies, they're found scattered all over the place. Some are, partially undressed. And the injuries, some of them had these horrific internal injuries, think car crash level trauma, but no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises. Then there's this whole thing about strange stuff found on their clothing, some of it even radioactive. And here's the kicker, no signs of a struggle, none. They didn't even try to fight back. And then you've got these almost supernatural details. People talking about orange skin, hair turning gray way too fast, and even sightings of weird orange lights in the sky around the same time. It's like a pile of clues that don't make any sense.
It really is. And that's what we're going to dig into today, right? All those key details. We're going to look at the most popular theories out there and try to figure out why this case is still so captivating, Why does it still feel unsolved, like a loose end in history?
Okay, so let's meet these hikers one by one. Leading the pack was, as we said, Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a radio engineering student. Everyone says he was experienced, super organized, a planner. The fact that someone so capable was in charge makes the whole thing even creepier. It wasn't just some random group. This was a serious, well-prepped expedition. Right, yeah. Not a bunch of amateurs following some clueless dude. These were hikers with a solid track record, which, to be honest, just makes their fate all the stranger. If they couldn't survive, who could? Then you got Yuri Doroshenko, also radio engineering, just 21, known for being really brave, actually.
Yeah.
There's this story. Apparently, he once faced down a bear with, just a geologist's hammer. He was found by a small fire, almost completely naked. And this is important. He had these weird burns on his body.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of those burns in that kind of cold?
The burns, right? They're super unsettling. It screams desperation, trying to stay warm somehow. But then what caused them? Was it the fire? Something else, and why was he practically naked in that kind of weather? Doesn't make sense.
Then there's Lyudmila Dubanina, 20 years old, engineering student. Strong personality, that's what everyone says. Her discovery was especially gruesome. Severe chest injuries, and, get this, her tongue, eyes, and lips were missing. it's hard to even think about.
Dubinina's injuries, yeah, those are the ones that really stick with you, don't they? Definitely the most shocking part of the whole case. And, it's fueled some pretty wild theories, for sure. Some experts say those missing parts, maybe it happened after she died, animals scavenging during the spring thaw. But still, when you first hear about it, it's just horrible.
Okay, next we've got Georgiji, sometimes called Yuri Krivonischenko, 23, radio engineering grad. And here's something that really stands out. He worked at a top-secret nuclear facility. This is a big deal because, remember, we said there was radiation found on some of the clothing. It might be a coincidence, but it makes you wonder, right?
Yeah.
About contamination and what he was doing out there. He was also found near the fire with Doroshenko, and just like him, he had burns.
Krivonischenko's background, yeah, it throws a whole Cold War wrench into things, doesn't it? Nuclear secrets, radiation, it's like something out of a spy movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts him and his presence on this trip right at the center of a lot of theories about, government cover-ups and stuff like that.
Right. Okay, moving on, we have Alexander Kolovatov, 24, a nuclear physics student. Quiet, super smart, that's what I've read. Found in that ravine with those awful internal injuries we were talking about. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, studying civil engineering. Had a tough family history, actually. His dad, a French guy, was executed during Stalin's purges. Yikes. He had terrible skull fractures. It's just, those injuries, they're just such a key part of this whole puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. Multiple people with these massive internal injuries, but no marks on the outside. It's like, what kind of force is that? It had to be something incredibly powerful and very precise. It's just not something you see every day.
Definitely not. Then we have Rustam Slobodin, also 23, a mechanical engineering student. They found him like he was trying to get back to the tent. Poor guy. Fractured skull.
Yeah.
But they say it wasn't what killed him. And then there's Semyon, sometimes called Alexander Zolotaryov, the oldest of the bunch, 38. He wasn't a student, actually. Experienced hiker, fought in World War II. Had some unusual tattoos, apparently, and a bit of a mysterious past. Found with the same kind of chest injuries as Dubinina. His being older, not a student, makes you raise an eyebrow.
Yeah, Zolotaryov is definitely the odd man out, age-wise and background-wise. And it's led to a lot of speculation, what was his real reason for being on this trip? Was he just some nature enthusiast tagging along with a younger crowd, or was there something more to it?
Right. And finally, we have Yuri Yudin, the guy who turned back. Just 21 then. Sciatica it was. Bad luck for him, but it probably saved his life. And later on, he was pretty adamant that whatever happened, he thought the military was involved somehow. Coming from someone who knew the group and the whole situation, that's pretty significant, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yudin's survival makes him a unique witness, even though he wasn't there at the end. And his belief that the military was involved, that it wasn't just some freak accident, that carries a lot of weight, especially since he knew these guys personally.
The big takeaway here, is that this was a highly skilled group, well prepared. They weren't newbies. They'd hiked together before. They had the gear for a grade Thur expedition, which was no joke back then. They knew what they were doing. That's what makes the mystery so baffling.
Right, exactly. They weren't just wandering into the wilderness unprepared. They were experienced, organized, and that's what makes their deaths so inexplicable. They had the skills to survive, and yet.
Okay, so let's try to put together a timeline of this whole thing. The expedition kicked off on January 23, 1959. They left Sverdlovsk by train, heading towards Visa, which was like the last outpost of civilization before you hit the really remote parts of the Urals.
Yeah.
And so far, everything seems pretty normal, right? They're keeping diaries, taking photos. It's just a regular, though tough, expedition.
Yep, the beginning was just routine, all those photos, journal entries. It seems totally normal, which, makes what came next all the more disturbing. It's this stark contrast from everyday life to whatever happened out there.
So Yudin, he turns back on January 28th. The rest, the 9 of them, they get to the pass area around January 31st, February 1st. Now, this is important. They seem to have veered off their planned route a bit, heading towards this place called Kolatsiakal. It means, get this, dead mountain in the local Mansi language. Kind of ominous, right? And they end up setting up camp on this exposed slope instead of heading down into a more sheltered area with trees. What's really weird is that in the photos from that day, their last day, they look happy, relaxed. It just makes you wonder, why change plans? Why camp in such a vulnerable spot?
The choice of campsite, yeah, that's one of the big mysteries, right? Was it a mistake on Dyatlov's part? Did they hit some unexpected terrain and had to adjust their route? Or, and this is where it gets creepy, were they drawn there somehow? It's hard to say. But those photos, them smiling just hours before, it just doesn't make sense.
Then, silence. February 2nd, that's the day everything went wrong, as far as we know. but it takes until February 26th, almost a month, for the search party to find their camp. And it's that scene we talked about. The tent cut open, belongings left behind, those 9 sets of footprints heading out into the snow. Just that image alone, it just screams terror, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. It's like a snapshot of pure panic. And the fact that it took so long to find them, it just shows how remote and brutal this location was. And imagine being those searchers, stumbling upon that scene. It must have been terrifying.
The first bodies they find are Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, about 1.5 kilometers from the tent by a cedar tree. They're almost naked, huddled by the remains of a small fire. They've got burns, and this is crazy. They find branches broken off the cedar like 5 meters up, with bits of their skin embedded in the bark, like they were desperately trying to climb. What would make them do that in that state?
Yeah, those details, the broken branches, the skin. It's like a scene from a horror movie, isn't it? Like they were trying to escape something up that tree. And the fact that they were nearly naked, that points to paradoxical undressing, a classic sign of hypothermia. But then the burns, those don't fit so neatly.
Then they find 3 more, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. They were between the cedar tree and the tent, like they were trying to get back. They were better dressed, but still missing some crucial winter gear. Slobodin had that fractured skull, though it didn't kill him. So another injury, another piece of the puzzle. It suggests something violent happened, right?
It does, yeah. At least for Slobodin, it seems like those 3, they were maybe more aware of what was going on, trying to get back to safety. But something happened to them, something forceful enough to fracture a skull. It's just another question mark in this whole mess.
The last 4, they weren't found until May. The snow had to melt. They were in a ravine about 75 meters from that cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow. And they were the best dressed of the lot, like they'd taken clothes from the others. And this is where the really, really weird stuff comes in. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had these massive chest fractures. The force they describe, it's like being hit by a car, but no external wounds, nothing. Thibaut Brignol, crushed skull. And Dubinina, it's just, they found her without her tongue, eyes, and lips. Absolutely horrific. And to make things even stranger, some of their clothes had those higher than normal levels of radiation we talked about. It's just mind-blowing.
The Ravine group, yeah, they're the ones that really throw a wrench in the works, those injuries, especially the chest and skull fractures. No external damage. That's incredibly hard to explain. And then Dubinina's, well, her condition, plus that radiation on the clothes, it just throws this whole dark cloud over everything. These are the details that make people come up with all sorts of out there theories.
It just raises so many questions. I mean, think about it. Why would experienced hikers like these cut their way out of a tent in a blizzard and then run off half-dressed? What could cause that kind of internal damage, that kind of force, but leave no marks on the outside? Why the radiation? And what about those weird lights people saw in the sky? It's just question after question after question.
And that's the crux of it, isn't it? We've got all these anomalies, these pieces that refuse to fit. It challenges everything we think we know about what happened that night. And that's what keeps people so fascinated, so determined to figure it out.
So let's break down these weird findings one by one. The tent, cut open from the inside, all their gear just left there. It paints a picture like absolute panic, doesn't it? They weren't just leaving, they were escaping something. Whatever it was worse than freezing to death.
Yeah, and think about it. They abandoned their lifeline. Warm clothes, food, shelter. In that environment, that's basically suicide unless you're running from something even more deadly. It really underscores the level of fear they must have felt.
Then there are the bodies themselves. Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, almost naked, burns on their hands and feet. It was below freezing. What were they trying to warm themselves against? Dubinina, with those injuries, even if it was partly animals, it's just horrific. And Thibaut Brignol and Zolotaryov, crushed skull and chest, like they were in a vice. It's like some invisible force just crushed them. And then there are those less talked about details, the orange skin, the graying hair, maybe anecdotal, but it all adds to this feeling that something truly strange happened.
And the injuries aren't consistent, right? It's like they face different threats, or maybe it hit them in stages, but the internal damage with no marks on the outside, that's a big problem for a lot of the explanations people have come up with.
The radiation, too. That's huge. The fact that it was found on Zolotaryov and Krivonischenko's clothes, it just screams something's off. And, Krivonischenko working at that nuclear facility, it might be a connection, it might not, but it's a detail that a lot of folks who believe in, like, government conspiracies and stuff like that, they latch onto it.
Oh, definitely. Radiation in that location. It's not something you can just ignore. Whether it ties back to Krivonischenko's work or points to something else entirely, It's a huge question mark hanging over the whole case.
And then you've got the Soviet authorities, right? They were, let's say, less than helpful. Their official conclusion: unknown compelling force.
Yeah.
Talk about vague. And then they tell everyone to keep quiet about it, and the files get sealed for decades. I mean, that just feeds right into the whole cover-up narrative, doesn't it?
It's like they were begging people to come up with their own theories, you know? All that secrecy just breeds speculation. It's human nature. If you don't give people answers, they'll find their own, whether they're accurate or not.
And of course, it's that secrecy that makes the military experiment theory so popular. Could they have wandered into some restricted area? Some kind of weapons testing? Maybe they were hit by shock waves, maybe from those parachute mines or exposed to radiation. Some folks even think the whole scene was staged.
Yeah, when you think about the Cold War, all the paranoia and secrecy, especially in the USSR, it's not that far-fetched to think they might have stumbled onto something they shouldn't have. And those shockwaves, they can cause internal damage without leaving marks. It's possible, though debated.
And the rapid decomposition some people reported, that also gets brought up, like maybe it was because of some kind of experimental stuff they were exposed to.
It's possible, but it's a very speculative link. There are natural explanations for decomposition rates as well, especially in fluctuating temperatures.
Right. But there's no solid evidence linking the hikers to any specific military activity. No proof of explosions, no blast damage. And the Soviets, as secretive as they were, they never officially admitted to any military involvement. Plus, this theory doesn't explain the cut tent, does it? It doesn't make sense as they were just caught in the middle of some kind of test.
Exactly. It's a lack of hard evidence that really hurts that theory. It's circumstantial, intriguing, but ultimately, no smoking gun.
Then we've got those orange lights in the sky. Multiple people saw them, independently. It wasn't just one crazy story. What were they? Were they related to the incident? Were they military? Or something else entirely?
Those lights are fascinating, aren't they? If they were connected to what happened on the ground, it really changes the whole picture. But the question is, what were they? There are a lot of possibilities, but no definitive answers.
And even the footprints. They're weird, right? It's like they were walking away from the tent, not running in a panic. Which seems at odds with this whole idea of a terrifying threat that made them cut their way out. And then there's that journal entry. Now we know that the snowmen exist. So strange. Was it a joke? A reference to the Yeti, like some local folklore? Or a clue to something they actually saw?
That journal entry, oh man, it's like they were trying to tell us something, but we're just not getting it. It's too vague to take as proof of a Yeti encounter, but in the context of everything else, it's just unsettling. It makes you wonder.
All right, so let's talk theories. The 2020 official Russian explanation. Avalanche. They say a small slab avalanche hit the tent, caused a panic, they cut their way out, and then basically froze to death, or died from the injuries they got from falling.
The avalanche theory, yeah, it has gained some traction recently, especially with some newer research. Apparently, a small wind slab avalanche is possible on that slope, even though it doesn't look that steep. So that explains the panic, the cutting out of the tent, maybe some of the blunt force trauma, and, you know, the way they were dressed or undressed, that could fit with hypothermia, how it makes people do irrational stuff.
Right. It makes sense on the surface, doesn't it? Avalanche hits, you panic, you run. Makes sense. And hypothermia can make people do crazy things, like take their clothes off in freezing weather.
It's called paradoxical undressing, and yeah, it's a real phenomenon. It's like their body is trying to cool down because it's so confused. Tragic, but it happens.
But there are some big holes in that theory, the biggest. There's no evidence of a big avalanche. The tent was standing, no debris. And the injuries, they're all over the place. Some minor, some totally catastrophic. And these were experienced hikers. You think they'd camp somewhere with an obvious avalanche risk? Plus those footprints. They suggest a calm walk, not a panicked run.
Exactly. Those are the issues that make people doubt the avalanche theory. No clear signs of a major avalanche, the hikers leaving in a seemingly orderly way. It just doesn't fit perfectly.
Then you've got the katabatic wind theory. It's this sudden, powerful gust of cold air, like an invisible avalanche of wind. Basically, the idea is that this wind hit, forced them out of the tent. Maybe they cut it open to avoid suffocating, with the fabric pressing in on them. And then, blinded by the wind, the darkness, they stumbled into the ravine.
The katabatic wind theory, it tries to explain that sudden flight, right? And the extreme weather, no one doubts that it was brutal out there. It's like maybe they were just overwhelmed by the forces of nature, disoriented, confused, and that led to the falls, the injuries.
And those kinds of wind gusts can be deadly in the mountains, that's for sure. And hypothermia can make people act really irrationally. We know that.
Yeah, it's like your brain just shuts down, you can't think straight, and you make terrible decisions. It's terrifying, actually.
But this theory can't really explain those car crash injuries, right?
Yeah.
And the radiation. Plus, some of them are trying to get back to the tent. It doesn't fit if they were just running from the wind.
It doesn't know. Those are the two big sticking points. The really severe trauma and the radiation. If it was just the wind, those things wouldn't make sense.
Okay, the military experiment theory. This one's still popular, even though it's controversial. The basic idea is that the hikers wandered into some secret military zone. Maybe they witnessed a test or got caught up in it, maybe exposed to radiation, hit by a shock wave. Some even think the whole scene was staged afterward to cover it up.
Yeah, when you consider the Cold War, all the secret stuff going on, especially in the USSR, it's tempting to believe, isn't it? And the radiation, those strange lights in the sky, those feed right into it. It's like a spy thriller come to life.
And that rapid decomposition, right? Some people say that could be because of something experimental they were exposed to.
It's a possibility, but it's a big leap to make without more evidence. There are, as we said, more straightforward explanations for decomposition that don't involve secret experiment.
Right, of course. But the problem is there's no proof. No direct evidence linking them to any specific military activity. No explosions, no blast damage. And the Soviets never admitted to anything, even though they were known for covering stuff up. And, again, the cut tent. That doesn't really fit with the idea that they were just caught in some military test.
Yeah, the lack of concrete evidence is a big issue for the military theory. It's all circumstantial, which is frustrating, because it could be true, but we just don't know for sure.
There's also the infrasound panic theory. Infrasound. It's these sound waves, super low frequency, we can't hear them, but they can mess with us big time. Cause panic, anxiety, even disorientation. So maybe that's what made them run from the tent, made them act so irrationally. And the injuries. Maybe they fell in the ravine because they were so freaked out, disoriented.
Infrasound is real. It can have some pretty crazy effects on people. So in theory, it could explain why they'd suddenly run off, seemingly for no reason. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was this invisible force messing with their minds.
Right, exactly. It explains the panic without a visible threat. But, like the other theories, it doesn't really explain the injuries, especially those crushing injuries. It's hard to see how infrasound would do that.
And that's the catch, isn't it? It can't explain the panic, the flight, but not the specific trauma, especially those internal injuries with no external damage.
Okay. Then you go into the more, let's say, fringe theories, like the Yeti attack. People point to that snowman journal entry, or maybe aliens, because of those orange lights.
Those theories are fun to think about, but ultimately there's no real evidence for them. That snowman entry, it's way too vague to be proof of anything, and there's no link between the lights and the hikers' deaths.
Then you have the murder or espionage angle. Maybe some of the hikers were involved in something shady, carrying radioactive materials, and they got ambushed. Maybe those injuries were torture or something like that.
Yeah, that one plays into the whole radiation thing and the fact that some of them, like Zolotaryov and Krivonischenko, had those kind of mysterious backgrounds.
And it could explain the injuries, right? If it was a deliberate attack, it might make sense.
But if it was a straight-up murder, why not hide the bodies better? And there's no sign of any weapon wounds, no gunshots, no stabbings. It just doesn't quite add up.
The official Russian ruling in 2020, just to remind you, was the avalanche and hypothermia combo. A small avalanche triggers panic, they run, get injured, and freeze to death. Case closed.
It's a neat and tidy explanation, right? It emphasizes the power of nature, human error in a crisis situation. It's a kind of explanation that authorities like.
But a lot of people just don't buy it. They think the avalanche evidence is weak, that the radiation, the lights, all that was ignored too quickly. And then there's the whole Soviet history of cover-ups, right? It makes people suspicious.
It does, yeah. When a government has a reputation for secrecy and manipulating information, people are less likely to take their word for it, especially when there are so many unanswered questions.
And the people who do support the official ruling, they say, look, small avalanches happen. They don't always leave a ton of debris. The mountains are dangerous. People make mistakes. It's possible.
And they're not wrong. Nature can be incredibly powerful and unpredictable, and even the most experienced hikers can be caught off guard. And hypothermia, as we've discussed, can make people do really stupid things that lead to their deaths.
So here we are back at square one. That original unknown compelling force conclusion. It still feels relevant, doesn't it? Even after they reopen the case, even with all the new research, it still feels like none of the answers fully explain everything.
It's true. Each theory has its strengths, but none of them are perfect. They all leave some questions unanswered, which is, I guess, what makes this case so enduring.
It's the mystery, right? The cut tent, the missing clothes, the injuries, the radiation, those lights, the journal entry. It's like a perfect storm of weirdness. And the gap between the official explanation and all those unexplained things, it's unsettling. It's like we're missing something crucial.
And maybe we'll never know the full truth. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, it's like this reminder,
Yeah.
that we don't know everything, that some things just defy explanation. And that's okay. It's what keeps us searching, keeps us curious.
So our listeners, here's something to think about. Was this just a terrible but ultimately explainable natural event? Or was it something else, something secret, something hidden? Or maybe something even weirder? You've heard the facts, you've heard the theories. Now it's up to you. What do you think happened out there on Dead Mountain? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Dark Deeds and Conspiracy Podcast, and be sure to subscribe for more episodes on true crime mysteries just like this one. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and always keep searching for the truth.